All right, church, grab your Bibles, open up to Genesis chapter 25. We are in the final chapter of the story of Abraham. And the story of Abraham doesn't really end with Abraham. It goes throughout the Old Testament and goes into the New Testament and makes its way here. But story of Abraham does come to a close today, and his story comes to a close very similar to how our story will come to a close as well. It comes to a close with death. Death is a natural part of life. It's a part of life that we all experience in one way or another, and no matter how it comes, it is always difficult when it comes, and it leaves us with so many emotions. But the thing that death also allows us to do is it allows us to refocus on life. And I think that's the beauty of the transition of all of the end of our stories, is that it points to something bigger than just us. And when we look at Abraham's final breaths, we get to see something bigger than just Abraham. We get to see who God is and who God was for Abraham and how God showed up in Abraham's life and then what that did in Abraham's heart. Genesis chapter 25, we're gonna see Abraham's final breaths here. And what I wanna do today is I wanna look at two things that we learn about living by watching how Abraham died. And then what I want to do is also give you two practical things that you can do today to live in a generous way that Abraham lived in his death. So Genesis chapter 25, verses 7-8 specifically, we get to see Abraham's obituary. We get to see how the author of Genesis described Abraham and his life and summed his life up in these words in verses 7 and 8. And this is what he says. It says, "These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." Abraham, 175 years old. I mean, this brother, he drove that body as far as it would go. That's about as far as you can go. And he went all the way, and he gets to the end, and what was said about him is it was a good old age. He was an old man, and he lived that life full of years, and then he was gathered to his people, which is just this way to say that he got to be with his people. He got to be with his descendants, those who have put their faith in God and who followed after God. He gets to be with them. And that is a great ending of the story. It's a great ending of a story. That is one of the most beautiful summations of anybody's life in the scripture at the end of their life, that they were an old man full of years. And I think all of us would love to go out with that being said of us, is that we lived our life to the best. We lived it fully, and we lived it all the way to the end. And then we got to be gathered with our people, meaning this, that life wasn't over there, but then we got to live life even more. Now, what we get to see about Abraham's life and some of the verses that follow this obituary and some of the verses that precede this obituary is how he lived that life with his final breaths. We hear that he took his final breath, but as he's taken that final breath, what did he do with those final breaths? The first thing that we see is that Abraham passed down the promise. And that's what I would ask us today as well. That with the final breaths that we have in this life, will we pass down the promise as well? The following verses 9 to 11, it says this. It says, Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Now, it's interesting here. Isaac and Ishmael come together again. Isn't this what death tends to do? Funerals, they tend to bring family members together. The last time we saw Isaac and Ishmael, they were young boys. They were fighting. They were angry with each other. And then the family split up. Now these boys are grown. They've got families of their own. They're old men by this time, and they come back together to bury their father. It says they buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that was purchased from the Hittites. It goes on to say that it says there Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son. Now, the cave that Abraham was buried in, the hole was buried there. He was buried with his wife, Sarah. But before Abraham died, he'd lost his wife, Sarah, from old age as well. And when he was seeking to bury Sarah, the thing that we've come to find out is that he owned no property in this promised land that he was in. Abraham, in his old age, he was still a nomadic traveler. He was living in a tent. He was in the land of Canaan, but the land of Canaan still belonged to the Canaanites and the Hittites. And so when his wife Sarah died, he asked if he could purchase this field from one of them. And he purchased this field so that he can bury his wife. And now he also has passed. And we see that he was buried right next to Sarah in that same cave. Now what's interesting about that is that tells us something about the promise of God. It tells us that the promise of God didn't stop with Abraham. It started with Abraham, but it didn't stop with Abraham. In fact, Abraham never got to realize owning the land of Canaan, inheriting this land that he was promised. The only piece of land of Canaan that Abraham owned by the end of his life was the hole that he was buried in. That's what he inherited. Now the question is, does that mean that God's promise has failed? No, what we come to find out is that promise was passed down to the next generation and to the next generation. And generation after generation begins to inherit and settle different parts of the land until they possess this promised land. What we see here is that the promise is bigger than Abraham. When God makes us a promise, typically that promise is bigger than just our life. Typically, that promise was not meant to go into the grave with us. It was meant to be passed down to the next generation. And what we see here in this passage in verse 11 is that after the death of Abraham, what did God do? God blessed Isaac, his son. This is the baton being passed to the next generation. The story of Abraham up to this point is that God has looked at Abraham and says, Abraham, you will be a blessing. And those who bless you, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. And you are blessed. And then Abraham goes in the grave, but the blessing doesn't go in the grave. Where does it go? It goes on to the next generation. This is the author's way of saying that this promise is being passed down to the next generation. The baton of faith is passed along to Isaac. The relationship that Abraham had with God is passed along to Isaac. Now, you might remember how this story started. It started with God making this promise to Abraham and promising to bless him. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, this is what God told Abraham. He said, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. There's this assumption that this blessing will be passed along. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, by this time, all of the families of the earth have not been blessed. When Abraham lays down in the grave, all of the families of the earth are still clueless about what God is doing in and through Abraham. And so what we learn is this promise starts with Abraham, but then it gets passed on to the next generation, Isaac. And then if you keep reading the book of Genesis, you see that Isaac's story ends very similar to Abraham's does, in that Isaac dies. And he's actually buried in the same cave with Abraham. But that blessing continues on and continues on. We get to see that the promise starts in Genesis 12, but we get to see a culmination of this blessing being passed from generation to generation in Matthew chapter 1. The very first chapter of the New Testament, it starts with the person of Abraham. And it talks about this blessing, this promise being passed down. It says, Abraham was the father of Isaac. So it goes down to the next generation. And then Isaac was the father of Jacob. It's this promise, this baton being passed down to the next generation. And Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah, the father of, say it with me, Perez. I made it. I'm in the promise. That's why I'm up here. Is your name in here, anybody? Anybody in there? All right, some of you maybe. All right, so that's not really me though, but maybe a descendant, but this we know, Mexico did make it. All right. So it continues on and talks about how it then goes down to David and then Hezekiah and Josiah, but then in verse 16 we see that this promise goes down to a guy named Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of who Jesus was born, who was called the Christ. The promise started in the hands of Abraham. This baton that God had was given to Abraham, and Abraham passed it down and passed it down and passed it down until it culminated in a descendant who would be a blessing to all of the nations. And anybody who would speak well of him and anybody who would bless this descendant would be blessed. And anybody who would curse this descendant would be cursed. And what we see is that this blessing and this promise was passed down by Abraham even in his death. But then it doesn't even just stop here with the genealogy. But the New Testament continues on, and we get to see that this blessing that Jesus, the son of Mary, the son of Abraham, he does something with that promise and his blessing. And what does he do? He passes that blessing and that promise on. In Acts chapter 2, verse 39, after Jesus had been crucified and resurrected, in the first sermon ever preached, it says this: "For the promise is for you and your children, and for all who are far off, even into the 21st century, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself." Which means this: you made the scriptures as well. That your name is in the scriptures as well. That if you have received that baton, if you have called on God and God has called you to him, then the baton now, the promise of Abraham now, sets in your hands. And so here's the question I would have for you. Will you do like Abraham did and pass that promise down to who's next? Will you pass it down to who's next? Or will you take that baton into the grave with you? Unfortunately, I think too many Christians these days, they receive the blessings of God and the promise of God, and they're so grateful for the promise of God, and they're formed into the likeness of image, but they take that promise that's been given to them, that promise that is forming them, and they take it into the grave and never pass it on to the next people. And my prayer is that, especially if you are a parent, that your prayer and your focus of your household is passing along the promise of God to the next generation. But can I tell you this? If you have no descendants, if you have no kids, if you're not a parent and you don't even desire to be that right now, the baton is still your hand, which means it's incumbent upon you to pass that baton on to whoever's next. What I love about how God works is that I believe that God puts that promise in Christian hands, but then he puts that Christian in context around people who need that promise. Here's what I believe about every single one of you. Every single one of you are in a relationship or in a context where somebody needs the promise of God in their life. I believe that's true of every single one of you. And the question we have to ask is, do we have the courage to share that blessing and that promise with someone who's going to be the next to pass it along? Who will you pass down the promise to? One of the things that we learn about Abraham is he passed down the promise to the next generation. So what's a practical way that we can do that this year as well? Well, one of the practical ways we're going to do that in this upcoming season, this Christmas season that is all about Jesus, is we're going to turn the Christmas season in a season where we don't just celebrate Jesus, but we pass on Jesus to other people. In December, starting in 2 weeks, we're going to start a brand new series that we're calling Christmas at the Movies. Christmas at the Movies. And I gotta tell you, I'm excited about this series because we haven't done a fun series at Harvester in a long time. We're talking about death today, people. And so what we're gonna do in the month of December is we're gonna do a series that we're calling Christmas at the Movies. And during this series, we are going to have popcorn available throughout the lobbies. There's gonna be candy available. There's gonna be photo booth opportunities for you and your kids to get pictures of. You guys are really excited about this. You don't even know what a movie theater is. All you know is Netflix. Who remembers movie theaters? Yeah. They were great experiences and they were fun experiences, but what we're gonna do specifically with this series is each weekend, we are going to focus on a different classical movie that many of you have watched, and we're going to see some parts of that story. But then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take that story and show how Jesus has a better story for us. But here's the purpose of the series. The series is not geared towards you. The purpose of the series is to introduce the people in your life who don't know Jesus, but they know these stories. And I want to take the stories that they know, what they're familiar with, some of the pains that they have gone through in life that are represented in these Christmas movies, and I want to build a bridge from what they know to a story that they may not know, to a hope that they do not know as well. But what we have to do is have the courage to invite someone. And so what we've done today is you walked in, everybody should have received a movie ticket. And this movie ticket is not for you, okay? You get in for free, all right? You get in for free, but this movie ticket is an invitation that I want you to pray about over the next week and a half, 2 weeks, about who you're gonna give this invitation to. And I want you to invite someone to hear the story of Jesus, to hear the hope of Jesus. And they're gonna walk on campus and they're gonna step into a church, and usually people are uncomfortable with churches. They think God's gonna strike them dead because of all the sins that they've committed in their lives. And my hope is that they walk onto our campus and they experience something that's familiar, and they experience a people who love them and a people who care about them. And then when they sit in this moment, they hear about a Lord and Savior who cares about them more than we do. And so invite someone. Maybe that's a family member who doesn't know Jesus. Maybe it's a neighbor who doesn't know Jesus. Maybe it's a coworker who's going through a difficult time and needs the hope of Jesus. I hope you'll give that invitation to them, invite them. The one part of the ticket, the white part of it, they're gonna be able to rip off when they get here, and we're gonna give them a free popcorn or a free candy, movie theater candy, just as our way of saying welcome to Harvester Christian Church. So make sure that you are passing along the promise that was passed to you. Can you do that, church? Awesome, amen. Second thing that we learn about Abraham and his life through his death is this, and it's a piece of advice that I would pass along to you that Abraham lived into. It's this: do your giving while you're living. Do your giving while you're living. Now, I know some of you are generous and some of you are Scrooges, aren't you? And you know which one you are. People have told you, you're such a Scrooge during Christmas time, right? But here's the reality of all of us. Here's what I also know about every single person in this room, but I also know this about every single person who lives on this planet Earth today. It's this: every person will be generous. Do you know that that's true? Every single person, even the non-generous people, will be generous. Because every single one of us will give away everything that we have. When you die, everything will be given away, right? So now here's the question I would have. Would you rather be generous in life, or would you rather be generous in death? Hey guys, can you listen up over here? Thank you guys, thank you so much. Would you rather be generous in life, or would you rather be generous in death? All right, how many of you would rather be generous in life? Raise your hand, up with me. All right. How many of you are like, no, I'm gonna hold on to everything, I just want the government to have a lot of it whenever I die? Or you want the government to make the decision for you? Anybody? No, here's what we've gotta do. We've gotta live into the life that we're living now. And that's what Abraham does in Genesis chapter 25, verses 1-6. Turn over there in your Bible. It's just a few verses before Abraham's obituary. It says this: Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. Did you guys know that Abraham got remarried? So his wife Sarah dies. We often miss this part of the story, that later on in life, he marries again to this woman named Keturah. And then this is what happens in that marriage. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. All of these were the children of Keturah. And then it goes on to say this. It says, Abraham gave all that he had. How much did he give? Let's go on to the next slide here. Abraham gave all that he had. How much is that? All. He gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of Keturah, to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave them gifts while he was still living. Did they inherit this when he died? No. He gave while he was still living. He wanted to choose his generosity would be impacting his children. And so he gave while he was still living, and then he sent the sons of Keturah away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. Now, this wasn't in a way that says, you guys are bad, you need to get out of the land. It was, I want you guys to own land, and Isaac owns this land, and so you need to grow your families and your kingdoms outside of Isaac's kingdom. And what we see about Abraham is that Abraham gave his inheritance while he was still living. Now, what we remember about Abraham's story, you might remember this, is that Abraham's life wasn't easy, was it? Well, I don't know that I would describe his life as easy. All the things that he had to experience in life, but he did live his life in faith, even when it wasn't easy. Let me give you a 3-sentence overview of Abraham's life. This is how I'd explain Abraham's life in summary. Abraham left everything, then he gained everything, and then he gave everything. He left everything in faith, he gained everything in faith, and then he gave everything in faith. The story starts off, Abraham's story, with God saying, Abraham, leave everything behind. Leave your land, leave your family, and go to this place that I will show you when you get there. Just trust me, Abraham, just leave it all behind, and I'll show you that I'm faithful. And what does he do? He leaves everything behind. And then all along the story, every step of the way, even when Abraham stumbles, what does God do? He enriches Abraham time after time after time, and he gains livestock, he gains wealth, he gains this child finally that he's been praying for, Isaac, and he gets to this point where he's gained everything. And now the end of his story, we see him just giving everything, that he gave all that he had while he was still living. Now, why was Abraham so generous? Why was he generous? It's because he experienced a giving God. All along the story, even in the midst of the struggles, even in the midst of the pain, even in the midst of loss, Abraham is experiencing a giving God. And Abraham, he wanted to be generous too. He wanted to be like his God. And so he was generous. What did Abraham learn in his generosity? This is what he learned, that the person who gives never goes without. The person who gives never goes without. But the person who protects, the person who schemes, the person who holds, the person who collects, those are the ones who experience the pain. And eventually, now 175 years old, Abraham's beginning to realize, it appears that I can't outgive God. That when I give, God gives. When I give, God gives. When I give, God gives. And what happened with Abraham is that Abraham gave everything. He gave everything. And then, what we read in his obituary was what? That he died on full. Let's read that one more time. It says this, Abraham died in a good old age, an old man and full of years. Abraham dies on full. Now, when we read full of years, what we read is that we think that they're talking about a quantity of life. What the author is talking about is a quality of life. Some translations will translate this phrase full of years as Abraham died satisfied. He died satisfied with life, which means this, that Abraham, he gave everything he had. He drove his life as far as it can go. 175 years he drove that body. 175 years he drove that life. He drove it through blessings. He drove it through trial. He drove it through miraculous life. He drove it through the death of his wife. He drove that life to his final breath. And then when he reached the end of the road, he looks down at the fuel gauge and it reads full. That's the life I want to live. I don't know about you, but I want to drive this life that God has given me. Each one of us, we only have a certain number of breaths that we get to breathe. And I got to tell you, I'm trying to drive it to empty. I want my life, I want my family, I want my influence, I want my heart, I want my mind to just be giving back. And I want to be able to outgive God, but what I'm beginning to realize is that no matter how much I give back, God seems to be more generous. And I want to get to the end of my life having breathed my last breath, saying I gave everything, but somehow God has still been gracious to me. And somehow, even in my final breath, I feel satisfied and I feel full. Some of you have loved ones who have lived that way, don't you? You have people in your life who they've driven their body, they've driven their influence, and they've given all they've had, and they reach the end, and it appears that There's more to come for them. That's my hope for each one of us. So the question I would have is this: will you give while you live? Will you give while you live?